welcome back to another Google Slides presentation. If you happen to be watching this presentation on YouTube, just keep in mind that any of the links that are embedded in the presentation won't work, but there's a playlist to the video links on our channel under Inherited and Learned Traits. If you're in Google Slides, please turn on your sound and put the presentation into present mode. This presentation is going to focus on inherited versus learned traits and behaviors. Our objective today is I can differentiate between inherited and learned traits and behaviors. We're going to start out by remembering the difference between a trait or a behavior. This was covered more extensively in my first presentation about different animal adaptations, but you also have to have that understanding to be able to do the difference between inherited and learned traits and behaviors. So a trait, if we're talking about a trait, we're talking about a physical characteristic of an animal or a plant. So you're going to have to think about like body parts or plant parts if we're discussing a trait. If we're discussing a behavior, then it's an action or something that the organism is doing. So you're going to have to think about what is being done if we're talking about a specific behavior. We're going to start with the word inherited. Inherited means that something is passed down from a parent to an offspring through genetics. Now, within that definition, there's several words that you have to understand to truly understand the definition. So when we're talking about genetics, it's relating to the genes you have or the DNA. So it's coded into your body and it's passed down from a parent. An offspring would just simply be the baby animal or the baby plant. And a parent, we're talking about the biological father or mother that produces the offspring. I understand parents can be more than biological, but when we're talking about something that you inherit genetically, it has to be from a biological mother or father. Let's look at some examples. So what are some inherited traits of people? Well, hair color can be inherited, as we see in this picture of this family with the redheads. But you notice that dad in this picture is not a redhead. So all of these girls inherited their hair color from their mother. Another inherited trait would be the type of earlobe that you have. There are two different types shown in the pictures here. You can see that the picture on the left, the earlobe is actually attached to the side of the head. And in the picture on the right, the earlobe is what we call detached. There's a space between the earlobe and the head. And so there are different types of earlobes on different people, which you may have never noticed before, and that's actually inherited. It's passed down through the parents. Another example would be the ability to curl your tongue in from the sides. This is actually something that I cannot do, no matter how hard I try. My students in class like to watch me because they don't believe that I really can't do it. It's not something I can practice or train myself to do. It's something that genetically was passed down through my parents. And so actually once I learned that that was a genetic trait, I went and asked my parents, could they do it? My mother actually can, but my father cannot. So clearly I inherited that trait from my father, my inability to curl my tongue. My brother, however, actually can curl his tongue, so he inherited that from our mother. Your blood type would be another example of a trait that is inherited from your parents. Depending on the type of blood your parents have, that would indicate what type of blood that you would have. There's a thumb characteristic, the way that your thumb bends backward. Normal thumbs don't bend all the way backwards. Mine actually does. I have that hitchhiker's thumb where it will flip over backwards, and that's an inherited trait. And then the same thing with a cleft chin. You can see in that first picture there's a little dent in the chin, and in the second picture there's not. And again, there's nothing right or wrong about having a cleft chin. It just happens to be the way that you inherited your chin from your parents. There are lots of other examples of inherited people traits, including like if you have dimples, right-handed, left-handed, the shape of your pinky, if your pinky's curved, different finger lengths, if your middle finger's long, your ring finger and your index finger are the same, there's different traits like that. So your skin tone, lots of other different traits that you can inherit from your parents. But basically, if it's a physical characteristic, if it's something, a physical part of your body, that would be something that you would be inheriting from your parents. Next, we'll look at what are some inherited traits of animals. Yes, I know that people are animals. However, the traits that we're talking about that people inherit are slightly different than the traits we're talking about for animals. So for animals, I have fur color, which is similar to the hair color in people. But if you look here, the one dog has the chocolate fur and one dog has the blonde fur, and you can see the puppies got one or the other from the parents. Ear shape, ear size is something that differs within the animal kingdom, and so you can see different types of cat ears that could be inherited or passed down from the parent to the offspring. The size of the animal is also something that is going to be inherited from the parents. So you're not going to have, two Chihuahuas that make a puppy that comes out the size of the Great Dane that's in the last picture there. So there's generally going to be a size range that they're going to make about the same size of animal. The number of legs, so some animals have no legs, like a snake, and some animals have 4, and some animals have 2, some animals have wings. That's something that's going to be passed down through the parents. The placement of the eyes is also going to be passed down. There are different eye placements that we talked about whenever we were doing the adaptation. So we have the predator animals that are going to have their eyes more central, more in the front of their face, and the prey animals that's eyes are more out to the sides of their face. That's something that's inherited and passed down from parents. And then any other special adaptations that we talked about. We talked about a ton of adaptations in that first video. Here I have a picture of the tortoises with their shells. So that's going to be passed down from the parent to the offspring. They're going to continue to have that same adaptation for survival. Plants can actually have inherited traits too. So you're going to have parent plants. There are still plant parts where plants reproduce. And so depending on the plants that reproduce together, that's going to create the offspring plant, which is going to look like its parents. So we have different root types. Some roots have the some plants have the fibrous roots that spread out and are closer to the surface. Other plants have tap roots, which are a more of a singular root that goes deep down. And so the type of root would be passed to the offspring. The flower color is something that would be inherited from the parents. The leaf shape, also leaf size, would be something that would be inherited from the parent plants. The type of stem and the length of stem that we're looking at, we have those green stems that are bendy, and we have the bark, the brown stems that have the bark that are more rigid. The height of the plant, okay, you have redwoods, of course, being those tallest trees, all the way down to something that's just a shrub that's very, very small. And then any specialty features or special adaptations, so again, like those carnivorous plants, like we have the Venus flytrap here in this picture, those carnivorous plants are going to produce offspring that are also carnivorous plants. We've looked at all kinds of traits that can be inherited, but behavior can be inherited too, and we normally don't call them inherited behaviors. Oftentimes they're called instincts or innate behaviors because this is something that the animal doesn't have to be taught how to do. It's something that they just know, and they know whenever it's time. A good example of this would be like the chrysalis that you see on your screen that was spun by the caterpillar. Nobody has to teach the caterpillar how to do it. Nobody tells the caterpillar whenever it's time. It's something that it's just innate. It's in them, and they know it, and they know how to do it when it's time to do it. So here's some other common examples of those instincts or inherited behaviors. So spiders, the web weaving that spiders do, again, that's not something that they're taught. That's something that spiders know how to do. Nest building for birds. Hibernation is common in animals, and so like they'll have the bear there that would hibernate whenever it gets cold. And then also migration. I have an example here of these geese that migrate from the northern areas to the southern areas in the wintertime because it's warmer in the south. So again, the inherited behaviors or instincts are not things that the animals have to be taught to do. It's something that the animal does automatically in response to what's going on around them, something they're born. It's inside of them. They just know how to do it. There are, of course, other examples, blinking, herding behaviors, crying. Babies know how to cry whenever they're born. And so these are all examples of inherited behaviors or instincts. We're going to do a summary so far. So the first thing we talked about was the word inherited, and that inherited means it's passed down from the parents to the offspring. We're talking about physical traits and certain behaviors that can be inherited. The second thing we talked about is that people and animals inherit physical traits, and we talked about all kinds. Hair color, fur color, facial features, ear shapes. The way the people and the animals look is largely inherited. Third, we talked about the fact that plants can inherit physical traits too, such as their leaf shapes, their seed types, flower colors. All of those things are inherited. And lastly, we talked about animal instincts or innate behaviors are inherited, such as web spinning, hibernation, migration, nest building. Those are all behaviors that are not taught. Those are behaviors that are inherited, also called instincts or innate behaviors. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've been talking about inherited. Now we're going to switch over to the opposite of that, which would be learned or acquired. So learned means an organism had to be taught the behavior. This teaching can occur in many different ways. The person or animal could learn by watching another animal. There could be actual teaching with practice, or the activity could just be self-taught. Acquired means gained by effort or caused by environmental factors. So basically, the word acquired means you got it later than birth. You had to get it later. And so sometimes they're used interchangeably. Sometimes people will say learned or acquired. Normally, acquired is going to go more with the traits of a person, and we'll get to that when we go through the slideshow. And learned is going to be something that you actually had to practice or think about watching somebody else or doing on your own in order to get it right. I think this might be a little bit more clear once we look at some examples on the next slides. Let's talk about some learned behaviors for people. Pretty much most of your behaviors actually are learned behaviors because you're not born knowing how to do many things. Reading would be a learned behavior, pretty much any of your schoolwork. If you're learning to do math, if you're learning to do a science experiment, those are all things that you had to learn. At home, cooking would be a learned behavior. Skateboarding, or any other kind of sports for that matter that you might be into, playing instruments, learning to drive a car. If you're into playing Pokemon or playing a certain video game, you have to learn, even if somebody doesn't show you how, by trial and error working through that video game, you learn what to do on each level. So those are all examples of behaviors that we learn to do. They're not inherited, they are learned behaviors because we had to be taught, or we had to be shown or practice how to do it. I put these two on a separate slide because they are huge misconceptions. I think because we start language at such a young age and most people grow up within their same religion their entire life, it's very confusing. But language and religion are actually learned behaviors. So if we're talking about the fact that I speak English, okay, I speak English because I learned to speak English as I was growing up. Had you taken me from my two English-speaking parents and I had grown up with a family in Japan who only spoke Japanese, then I would have learned Japanese as a child. So even though you learn it, you start learning it as a baby, and so you don't even remember learning language, language is something that you have to learn. The language that you speak, even though it's the same as your parents, you didn't inherit it from them, you learned it from them. Okay, again, had we given you different parents, then your language would have been different. Same thing with the religion that your family uses. That is something that you learn. It's from your parents. It's not passed down. Okay, if we took you and gave you to a family who was of a different religion or no religion at all, it's not something that you would have grown up understanding and knowing. It wasn't born in you. You learned it as you grew up. And those two are very, very commonly misunderstood by students, especially the language one that shows up on a lot of quizzes and tests, because you learn it so young. But again, you learned it. You have to learn how to talk. Babies don't know how to talk. They learn it. And they learn English because that's what they're around. Okay, if we took you as an English speaking child and gave you to any other language family in the world, you would grow up learning to speak that language as long as you were around them and as you were first learning your language. Okay, you can learn a second language. There are lots of people who are bilingual or trilingual and they learn multiple languages, but again, they had to learn each of those languages that they speak. Animals can actually learn behaviors too. Of course, we all know people who have dogs who learn tricks, or we've seen circus animals or SeaWorld animals that all do types of tricks, and those are definitely learned behaviors. They're behaviors that have to be practiced and taught to be done on that command. Animals can also learn things like using tools from other animals. And here in this picture we see a chimpanzee, and he's using a stick to poke down into what looks to me like a termite mound in order to get the bugs out. That's something that the chimpanzee either had to figure out for himself, or that's something that the chimpanzee learned by watching another animal. So they can learn to use tools. Animals can also learn to find food. So if I have here a raccoon that's in a trash can, sometimes people call them trash pandas, they learn that they can get food from different various sources. So they would naturally not go to trash cans to get food out of. That's something that they learned. Oh, hey, behind this restaurant each night, they're going to throw out different materials, and I'm going to be able to get that as my food. Let's see. Hunting is another. Now, some animals do have instincts to hunt, instincts to be predators, but in other examples, like here in this example, this circle, this is actually a dolphin, and it's creating a mud ring. And the dolphins are taught to do this by their mothers. And so whenever they swim in a circle like this and they use their tails to flip up a bunch of mud, the fish that are inside of that mud circle, they're trapped, and they start to try to jump out of the water to get out of the mud circle, and the dolphins are waiting to catch them as they come out and come through. So this is a hunting technique that's taught or passed down. Other animals are also taught hunting techniques through their parent. They also may not be a hunting technique, but they may learn which berries they can eat, things like that, which animals are good to hunt. So there are lots of hunting things that are learned by the baby animals from the parent animals. And then also sounds. This particular bird here is a bird, and a mockingbird. I use that one on purpose because they can mimic pretty much any sound if they hear it. They can mimic car alarms and things like that. But there are other birds that they don't mimic everything, but they do learn specific songs from the parent birds. So that there's that. And then of course there'd be parrots and things that learn how to talk. But again, all of these are learned behaviors. These are things that the animals did not know whenever they were born, and they had to learn it either by watching someone else or listening to someone else or just practicing it on their own. This next slide is all about acquired traits, and I've put animals and people, but generally this is more going to be people that acquire the traits. An acquired trait is either gained by effort or caused by an environmental factor. So here I have like tattoos or piercings. That's something that the person has to specifically try to get. You go get a piercing or you go get a tattoo. You're purposefully modifying your appearance. So it is a physical trait that your ears are pierced or that you have a tattoo, but it's not something that you inherited. Your mother may have pierced ears, and when she gives birth to you, you don't come out with pierced ears. Okay, so that's something that you get after the fact, or you acquire it after birth. Your hair dye or a hairstyle, I've been asked by kids about, well, what if I had brown hair but I dyed my hair red? Well, if you dye your hair, you're acquiring that trait. You weren't born with that trait of red hair. Same thing with using a hair straightener or getting your curly hair. That's something that you changed. You might have been born with or inherited. I have stick straight hair. Was born with it. I inherited my straight hair. But I can go to the salon and pay to get a perm put into my hair that will cause it to be curly and to stay curly. Let's see. Scars is one that's more common with, it's common with people and animals, but it's a good animal example. So a scar, they're not born with the scar, but it comes about through an accident or through fighting, things like that. So the scar becomes a permanent part of their body. It's something that they acquire later in life. Some of them as early as an infant, but most often scars come later on through a surgery or an accident, something of that nature. And then lastly on this slide I have large muscles, and you can see the difference there between the extremely muscular arm and then the somewhat muscular arm. All animals have muscles. That's part of how they move. But the muscles, the tone of the muscle and the size of the muscle is going to be determined by how much you work that muscle out. So those large, giant muscles, you could acquire that. You were born with the muscles, but you could acquire the size of the muscles by working them out, training them. The biggest thing to remember with acquired traits is that the acquired trait stops with that given organism. They are not passed down from a parent to an offspring. So even in the instance of like having a scar, the offspring of the parent is not going to have that same scar whenever they're born. So acquired traits stop. There's something that the animal or person got later in life, and they will stop with that person. They won't be passed down genetically. That's pretty much everything that you would need to know as far as inherited versus learned traits and behaviors. Remember, inherited means passed down, and learned or acquired means that we had to figure it out or get it after birth. So we could have inherited traits, being how we look, physical body parts. We could have inherited behaviors like our instincts, things that are innate, that the animal is born knowing how to do it. We could have learned behaviors or we could have acquired traits, changing our hair color, piercings, scars, things like that we got after. So let's do a couple of practices now that we've gone through what you should know. Robins have orange chest feathers. Well, having the chest feathers, that would be a physical trait. So we're talking about a trait, and they don't get to choose the color of their feathers. They're a bird, and so they're born that way. So this would be an inherited trait. Redwoods are among the largest trees in the world. So we're talking about the size of the tree. That would be a trait of the tree. And they don't have a choice in that. It's something that they get because their parent redwoods were also extremely tall. So this again would be an inherited trait. Hunting dogs find birds that have been shot and bring them to their owners. So bringing a bird back to its owner, that would be a behavior. And that's not something that a dog would automatically know to do, especially if it's a hunting dog and I'm teaching it to retrieve animals that I've shot. So this would be a learned behavior. Dairy cows return to the barn each night after spending the day in the pasture. Well, because they're returning to the barn, that's an action, so we're talking about a behavior. And the dairy cow doesn't automatically know what a barn is or that they should come back to the barn at nighttime. So that would be something that they had to learn, that that's the expectation that they come into the barn in the evening. So this again would be a learned behavior. Knowing division and multiplication facts makes it easier to work in math. Well, working out a math problem, that would be something that you have to learn how to do. And so it's not something that you're born knowing how to do, it's a behavior, and so this would be a learned behavior. Reptiles are animals whose bodies are covered with scales. If we're talking about being covered with scales, then that would be a trait of the animal, and it's not something that they acquire later, it's something that they're born with. So the scales on a reptile would be an inherited trait. Earthworms have no eyes. Having no eyes would be a physical trait, so we're talking about traits, and they are born that way. None of the earthworms have eyes. It's an inherited trait. In Yellowstone National Park, bears return to trash cans to look for food. So going to a trash can to look for food, that would be an action. So we're talking about a behavior. And this is not a normal behavior for bears. This is something that they had to learn to do. So this is a learned behavior. The female wood thrush lays turquoise eggs. So she is laying eggs, and that's a trait of birds, is that they do lay eggs. I know it sounds like a behavior, but the fact that her eggs are turquoise, that she doesn't have any control over that. So this would be inherited. It would be an inherited behavior, which we could also call an instinct. In this case, I would more go towards an inherited behavior because we're talking about the actual trait of the eggs being the turquoise color. And again, the birds don't get to choose the color of their eggs, so that's something that's inherited and passed down that all wood thrushes are able to do. A bad burn will often result in a scar. So having a scar is a physical trait, but it's not a trait that you're born with. This is something you acquired later on in life due to that burn. So this would be considered to be an acquired trait. Red bats spend summers in the north and migrate to the south for winter. So here we're talking about migration, which is a behavior where they change locations based on seasons. And so this behavior, no one teaches the bat to do that. This would be something that they inherit. So it's an inherited behavior, or in this case, we would call migration to be an instinct. A chimpanzee uses a ladder made from objects to reach a piece of fruit on a rock. Well, using a ladder, that would be a behavior, and that's not something that chimpanzees automatically know to do. So to stack things up to create that ladder in order to reach something that was too high is something that they would have to learn or figure out. So we're looking at a learned behavior. Many kindergarten children know how to tie their shoes. So tying shoes is a behavior, and it's not something that they are born knowing how to do. It's something they have to learn. So this is a learned behavior. Approximately 65% of the population can roll their tongue from the sides to the middle. Rolling your tongue from the sides to the middle is a behavior. It's a trait that people have or they don't have, and it's something that they're born being able to do or not able to do. We talked about this one earlier, that I physically cannot do that. So this is something that's inherited. This would be an inherited trait or an inherited behavior. Since it's not an instinct, it's not something that is just, you know when to do it. It happens with the seasons, or it happens automatically in response. It's something you can choose to do or not to do. We would typically go with this being an inherited trait. Samantha got her ears pierced when she was a baby. Okay, so this is a trait that she has. She has pierced ears, but she was not born with it. So she got that done when she was a baby. That would be an acquired trait. So I want to thank you all for watching. This is the end of my presentation about inherited versus learned or acquired traits and behaviors. After this slide, there are some more slides that have links to different videos about it, and also some more practices with an answer key at the end. If you are viewing this on YouTube and you can't get to those links, there's also a playlist that is under my channel, which is Science Pontius, and it's the same links that I have in the Google Slides presentation that you can view that go along with this. So I hope you enjoyed, and again, if there's further activities if you're interested. Thank you.